Let's talk about the three largest countries in the world in terms of population. The largest, of course, today is China. China had, for a very long time, the largest population in the world. It grew very rapidly during the 19th and the 20th centuries. During the 1950s and 1960s, the Chinese Communist Party conducted a couple of horrific mistakes that led to, in addition to natural disasters, that led to terrible famines that killed millions within China. There are many other natural disasters that killed hundreds of thousands of people as well. But during this time, the communist planners in China never considered China's population to be a problem. In fact, that is a Maoist and, to a degree, a Marxist idea that population growth is good. The idea that population growth is good goes to the idea that the more human beings, the more workers, and the more workers, the more powerful the state. The more powerful the state, the faster the great communist revolution, the revolution of the workers' paradise. Well, it became clear that during the 1970s, Maoist ideas of population were dead wrong. And when Mao finally died in the mid-1970s, his successor, who finally rose through the ranks, Deng Xiaoping, his successor realized that something had to be done. And beginning around 1980, late 1970s, the one-child policy was put into place. The one-child policy was the idea that the state, the Chinese state, would have a very firm control over the reproductive behavior of each individual Chinese. So the one-child policy was actually put into place. It was instituted for the Han Chinese majority, and strangely, it may seem strange, but the minority groups were, for the most part, exempted from this one-child policy. That was largely because the minority groups are located on the periphery of the country. They were not concentrated in the eastern parts of China, and some of them, particularly the Muslim groups of Western China, traditionally had very large families and needed large families for the types of agriculture that they conducted, mainly pastoralism and living in the remote areas of China. But anyway, the Chinese Han majority population were the ones who were subjected to the one-child policy. It was strictest during the 1980s, and then during the 1990s began to be loosened up. And the one-child policy was, as you can read, a policy in which only one child per couple was allowed, and the couple who wanted to have a child had to apply for permission from the government to try to get pregnant. And once you had the one child, that was it. To have a second child brought some negative consequences. The idea that if you had a second child, if you went against the state policy, then you could receive penalties in your workplace. You could be forced to undergo an abortion. All sorts of things that here in the West we would consider horrific, Machiavellian ways for government to enforce itself on you. Major violations of human rights. Anyway, so was the one-child policy... the one-child policy was recently revoked in recent years. And it was revoked, but it was really not enforced for quite a long time anyway. Anyway, the one-child policy went along, and by the turn of the 21st century, it was pretty apparent that most Chinese young people were beginning to follow the pattern of their counterparts in the Western world, in Japan and Taiwan and other places, in which they were choosing to have smaller families because they were living in cities and they were working in service sector jobs. And so the tendency today in China, and even though there was lots of propaganda and so forth, is that, you know, small families are good, and small families are affordable, and small families are now the norm in China. So China is the largest country in the world, over 1 billion people, and because of the one-child policy, but more so because of economic development in the last 20 years, China's population growth rate has plummeted. It has gone from one of the fastest growing populations back in the 1960s to a relatively no growth country. Compare it to the second largest country in the world, India. India, unlike China, was a democracy, even though it was a socialist democracy. It was under more Western influence than China. And India, for quite a long time, had more of a population problem, at least it was perceived as a population problem, than China did. China took the fast and hard way to population reduction. India took the slow, more free approach to population reduction. During the 1970s, after Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb, in which he made the case that India was growing so rapidly that it should simply be abandoned as a lost cause by the West, and population growth was on its way to a Malthusian disaster. After Paul Ehrlich said these things, the government of India undertook fairly drastic population control programs, including the forced sterilization of a lot of women, particularly in the rural areas. And it did spend a lot of money on population control programs and attempts to reduce population growth through reducing the birth rate. So India did have sort of a paternalistic approach to population planning. But in the end, it was economic development that has really proven to change the way people think. And by giving families incentives to have smaller children, by being able to ensure their education in the future, and simply by the fact that children are surviving because of better nutrition and better health care. This is why we have a slowing down of the growth rate in India. Now, India is currently number 2 in terms of population size, but within the next couple of decades, sometime, India is going to surpass the population size of China. And so perhaps by the time you're a parent, if you're not already, India may be the largest population in the world. Now, the third largest population in the world is the United States. And the United States population growth rate is currently, if you only look at natural increase, it's similar to a lot of Western European countries. It has always had a little bit higher growth rate because in the United States, family size didn't decline quite as fast as it did in in Central and Western European countries. So family sizes in the United States are still a little bit larger. There are a little bit more incentives. There are more incentives for people to have children still, but our population growth continues to grow primarily from natural increase. Currently in the United States, natural increase is not very high, and what growth we do have is largely due to what's referred to as population momentum. Population momentum plus immigration continues to add to the population size.